The desert stretched endlessly under a sky that had been threatening rain for 3 days. Jake Morrison stood on the weathered porch of his ranch house, his calloused hands gripping the wooden railing as he watched dark clouds gather on the horizon like an approaching army. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the scent of distant rain and the promise of a storm that would either bring salvation to his drought-stricken land or tear apart everything he'd built with his bare hands. At 38, Jake had learned to read the desert's moods better than most men could read a book. The way the mesquite bushes bent in the wind, the nervous shuffling of his cattle in the distance, the way his old dog Rex had taken shelter under the porch hours ago, it all spoke of a tempest that would make this night one to remember. He pulled his worn Stetson lower over his eyes and walked back into the house, the screen door creaking on its hinges behind him. The interior was sparse but clean, furnished with the bare necessities of a man who lived alone and had grown comfortable with solitude. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel adorned with a few photographs from better times. His parents on their wedding day, his father teaching him to ride, and one picture he kept meaning to put away but never could. A young woman with auburn hair and eyes the color of sage, laughing at something beyond the camera's view. Jake poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot that seemed to stay warm on his wood-burning stove regardless of the hour. The bitter liquid had become his constant companion during the lonely evenings that stretched one into another, blending into years of the same routine. Wake before dawn, tend the cattle, mend fences, fix whatever the harsh desert had broken the day before, eat a simple dinner, and sit on the porch until the stars came out. It hadn't always been this way. Once this house had echoed with different sounds, laughter, conversations that lasted until midnight, the rustle of skirts moving through rooms that now stood silent. But that was 8 years ago, before everything changed, before she made her choice and left him standing at the altar of his own hopes. Thunder rumbled in the distance, low and ominous. Jake walked to the window and peered out at his land. The Morrison Ranch had been in his family for 3 generations, carved out of unforgiving terrain by men who refused to accept defeat. His grandfather had fought Indians and outlaws to claim this piece of desert. His father had survived droughts and floods to expand it. Now Jake worked alone to maintain what they had built, though some nights he wondered why he bothered. The first drops of rain began to fall, heavy and warm, hitting the dusty ground with small puffs of earth. Within minutes the scattered drops became a steady downpour, then a deluge that hammered against the tin roof like bullets. Jake smiled grimly. His cattle would drink well tonight, and the creek that had been reduced to a trickle might actually flow again. He settled into his favorite chair by the window, watching nature's fury unleash itself upon his domain. Lightning split the sky in brilliant white veins, illuminating the landscape in stark, dramatic snapshots. The wind howled around the corners of the house, seeking entry through every crack and crevice. This was the kind of storm that could wash out roads, flood arroyos, and strand travelers for days. Rex whined from his spot by the fireplace, his ears flattened against his head. The old dog had weathered many storms in his 12 years, but this one seemed different, more violent, more personal somehow. Jake reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears, offering what comfort he could. "Easy, boy. It's just rain and wind, nothing we haven't seen before." But even as he spoke the words, Jake felt an odd tension in the air, a sense that something was about to change. He'd learned to trust his instincts living alone in the desert, where a man's ability to sense danger could mean the difference between life and death. Tonight those instincts were screaming that this storm would bring more than just water to his drought-stricken land. The clock on the mantel chimed 10 o'clock, its brass pendulum swinging steadily despite the chaos outside. Jake finished his coffee and considered heading to bed early. The storm would likely continue through the night, and morning would bring its own challenges, checking for damage, looking for stranded cattle, clearing debris from the access road. He was rising from his chair when Rex suddenly lifted his head, ears perked and alert. The dog's entire body went rigid, focused on something Jake couldn't hear over the storm's roar. A low growl rumbled in Rex's throat, not aggressive but uncertain, confused. "What is it, boy?" Rex padded to the front door, his nails clicking on the wooden floor. He sat and stared at the door intently, his tail giving a tentative wag. Jake frowned and moved to the window, pressing his face against the glass and trying to peer through the rain-blurred darkness. Lightning flashed, and for a moment Jake thought he saw something moving near the gate, a shadow, a shape that didn't belong. But when the light faded and thunder crashed overhead, there was nothing but rain and wind, and the familiar silhouettes of his few remaining trees bending under the storm's assault. Rex whined again, more insistently this time, and pawed at the door. Then Jake heard it, barely audible over the storm, but unmistakable. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on his front door. His blood turned to ice water in his veins. In 8 years of living alone on this ranch, no one had ever come calling after dark. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, and the main road was even farther. Anyone caught out in this storm would have sought shelter long before reaching his remote property. The knocks came again, stronger this time, more urgent. Jake's hand moved instinctively to the Colt, .45 that hung on a peg by the door, a habit born of necessity in a land where danger could arrive on 4 legs or 2. But Rex's behavior suggested this wasn't a threat. The old dog's tail was wagging faster now, and he was practically dancing with excitement. Taking a deep breath, Jake grabbed a lantern and lit it with steady hands, then slowly opened the door. The storm rushed in like a living thing, carrying rain and wind and the wild energy of the desert night. Jake raised the lantern high, its warm light cutting through the darkness and falling upon a sight that stopped his heart completely. There, standing in his doorway like a vision torn from his deepest dreams and darkest nightmares, was a woman in a wedding dress. The white silk clung to her slender frame, soaked through and translucent from the rain. Her auburn hair, once perfectly arranged, now hung in wet tangles around her shoulders. She was shivering violently, her lips tinged blue from cold, her bare arms wrapped around herself in a futile attempt at warmth. But it was her eyes that undid him completely. Those sage-green eyes he'd tried for 8 years to forget, now looking up at him, with a mixture of desperation, fear, and something else he was afraid to name. "Hello, Jake," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. I didn't know where else to go." For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Jake Morrison stood frozen in his doorway, the lantern trembling in his grip as he stared at the woman who had haunted his dreams for 8 long years. Sarah Beth Coleman, or whatever her name was now, stood before him like an apparition conjured by the storm itself, her wedding dress a stark white against the black night behind her. "Sarah Beth," he breathed, her name feeling foreign on his lips after so many years of silence. She nodded, water dripping from her hair onto the wooden porch. May I come in? Please." The years fell away like autumn leaves, and Jake was 29 again, standing in the church in Copper Creek, watching the woman he loved walk down the aisle toward another man. The memory hit him like a physical blow, but he stepped aside and gestured for her to enter. Of course, get in out of this storm. Sarah Beth hurried past him into the warmth of the house, leaving a trail of rainwater on the floor. Rex approached her cautiously, tail wagging uncertainly. She looked down at the old dog and managed a weak smile. "Hello, Rex. You remember me, don't you, boy?" The dog's entire demeanor changed. His tail began wagging furiously, and he pressed against her legs, whining with joy. Sarah Beth knelt down, not caring about her ruined dress, and buried her face in the dog's fur. "At least someone's happy to see me," she whispered. Jake closed the door against the storm and hung the lantern on its hook, his movements deliberate and careful. He needed time to process what was happening, to understand why the woman who had chosen wealth and security over love was standing in his house, soaked to the bone in a wedding dress. "You're freezing," he said finally, his voice gruff with suppressed emotion. "Let me get you something dry to wear." "Jake, don't." He held up a hand, not trusting himself to hear whatever explanation she might offer. "Not yet. Let's get you warm first, then we can talk." He disappeared into his bedroom and returned with one of his flannel shirts and a pair of his smaller jeans. They would be too big for her, but they would be warm and dry. "You can change in there," he said, nodding toward the bedroom. "I'll make coffee." Sarah Beth took the clothes with shaking hands. "Thank you." As she disappeared into the bedroom, Jake leaned against the kitchen counter and tried to steady his breathing. 8 years. 8 years since he'd seen her face, heard her voice, felt the way his heart hammered against his ribs just from being in the same room with her. He'd convinced himself he was over her, that the wound had healed, leaving only a scar. But one look at her had torn it wide open again. He busied himself making coffee, his hands working automatically while his mind raced. Why was she here? Where was her husband? Charles Whitmore, the banker's son who could give her everything Jake never could. And why in God's name was she wearing a wedding dress? The bedroom door opened, and Sarah Beth emerged wearing his clothes. The flannel shirt hung loose on her slender frame, and she'd had to roll up the sleeves and pant legs, but the effect was strangely intimate. She looked younger somehow, more like the girl he'd fallen in love with all those years ago. "Better?" he asked, pouring 2 cups of coffee. She nodded and accepted the warm mug gratefully, wrapping her hands around it as if it were a lifeline. "Much. Thank you." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the storm continuing to rage outside. Finally, Sarah Beth moved to the window and stared out at the darkness. "I wasn't sure this place would still be here," she said quietly, "or that you would be. Where else would I go?" Jake's voice was carefully neutral. "This is my home. I know, I just thought maybe you'd have moved on, gotten married, started a family." The words hung between them like an accusation. Jake took a sip of his coffee, using the moment to choose his response carefully. "Some of us don't have that luxury." Sarah Beth flinched as if he'd struck her. She turned from the window to face him, and he could see tears mixing with the rainwater on her cheeks. "Jake, I need you to know—" "No." He set his coffee down harder than necessary. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to show up here after 8 years and expect me to listen to explanations or apologies or whatever this is." "This isn't about apologies," she said, her voice growing stronger. "This is about survival." Something in her tone made him look at her more carefully. Now that she was warm and dry, he could see what the storm and darkness had hidden. There was a bruise on her left cheek, faint but unmistakable. Her lower lip was slightly swollen, and when she lifted the coffee mug to her mouth, he noticed her hands shaking for reasons that had nothing to do with cold. "Jesus, Sarah Beth, what happened to you?" She touched her cheek self-consciously. "It's nothing. I fell. Don't lie to me." Jake moved closer, his anger replaced by concern. "Someone hit you." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "Please don't make me talk about it. Not yet. I need to be somewhere safe tonight." The broken quality in her voice undid all his carefully constructed defenses. This wasn't the confident young woman who had chosen security over love. This was someone who was scared, hurt, and desperate. Despite everything that had passed between them, Jake couldn't turn away from that. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "No one's going to hurt you." Relief flooded her features. "Thank you. But tomorrow, we talk. Really talk. About why you're here, about what happened, about everything." She nodded. "Tomorrow." Jake showed her to the small guest room he'd added to the house a few years back, bringing her extra blankets and pillows. As he was about to leave, she called his name softly. "Jake." He paused in the doorway. "Yeah? I'm sorry for all of it. I know that doesn't change anything, but I needed you to know." He studied her face in the lamplight, the face that had filled his dreams and haunted his waking hours for so many years. She looked older, more fragile than the girl he remembered, but still beautiful in a way that made his chest ache. "Get some rest, Sarah Beth. We'll sort this out in the morning." As he closed the door and walked back to his own room, Jake caught sight of his reflection in the hallway mirror. He looked like a man who'd just seen a ghost, which in a way he had. The ghost of his past, of the life he might have lived, of the love he'd never quite managed to bury. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the desert, but inside the ranch house, 2 broken souls tried to find peace in the eye of their own personal hurricane. Jake lay in his bed, listening to the rain on the roof and the soft sounds of Sarah Beth settling into the room next door. For the first time in 8 years, he wasn't alone in his house, but he'd never felt more uncertain about what the morning would bring. In the guest room, Sarah Beth pulled the blankets up to her chin and closed her eyes, finally allowing herself to feel safe for the first time in months. She'd made it. Against all odds, through the storm and her own fear, she'd made it back to the one place where she'd ever felt truly protected. But tomorrow would bring questions she wasn't sure she was ready to answer, and truths that might destroy what little hope she had left for redemption. The storm raged on, as if nature itself was unsure whether this reunion would bring healing or devastation to the 2 hearts sheltering within the old ranch house. Dawn came slowly to the desert, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold as the storm finally exhausted itself. Jake had been awake for an hour, sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over land that looked reborn after the night's deluge. The air smelled clean and fresh, washed by the rain, and his cattle were already making their way to the creek that now ran full and clear. It should have been a perfect morning, the kind that reminded him why he loved this harsh, beautiful country. Instead, all he could think about was the woman sleeping in his guest room and the conversation that awaited them. Rex padded out onto the porch and settled beside Jake's chair with a contented sigh. The old dog seemed more relaxed this morning, as if Sarah Beth's presence had filled some empty space in the house that Jake hadn't even realized existed. "What do you think, boy?" Jake scratched behind the dog's ears. "Am I making a mistake letting her stay?" Rex just looked at him with those wise brown eyes that seemed to understand more than any dog should. Jake had long conversations with Rex during the lonely evenings, but this morning the dog's silent companionship was enough. The sound of the guest room door opening made Jake's pulse quicken. He heard soft footsteps in the kitchen, the clink of ceramic against metal as she poured herself coffee. After a few minutes, Sarah Beth appeared in the doorway, still wearing his clothes, her hair pulled back in a simple braid. "Good morning," she said quietly. "Morning." Jake gestured to the chair beside him. "Sleep all right?" She settled into the chair, cradling her coffee mug. "Better than I have in months, honestly." "Thank you." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the desert come alive in the morning light. Birds called from the mesquite bushes, and a hawk circled lazily overhead, riding the thermals that were already beginning to form as the sun warmed the earth. "It's beautiful," Sarah Beth said finally. "I'd forgotten how peaceful it is here." "It's just dirt and rocks and stubborn cattle," Jake replied, but there was affection in his voice. "No, it's more than that. It's—" She paused, searching for the right words. "It's honest. Everything here is exactly what it appears to be. No pretense, no hidden agendas." Jake glanced at her sideways. "Unlike where you've been." The question hung between them like a challenge. Sarah Beth took a long sip of her coffee before answering. "Charles and I were married 6 years ago next month," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "It was everything I thought I wanted. A big house in town, servants, beautiful clothes, social standing. I was the banker's daughter-in-law, invited to all the right parties, welcomed into all the best circles." "Sounds like paradise," Jake said dryly. "I thought it was, for a while." She set her coffee mug on the porch railing and stared out at the horizon. "Charles was, charming, attentive. He showered me with gifts, took me on trips to San Francisco and Denver. Everyone said I was the luckiest woman in Colorado territory. But it wasn't real. None of it was real." Her voice grew quieter. "The charm disappeared as soon as we were married. The gifts came with conditions, expectations. I wasn't a wife. I was a possession. Something beautiful to display at parties and then put away when company left." Jake felt a familiar anger building in his chest, not at Sarah Beth, but at the man who had hurt her. "Is that when he started hitting you?" She touched her cheek unconsciously. "Not at first. At first it was just words, criticism disguised as helpful suggestions, comments about my appearance, my conversation, my worth as a wife. He had a talent for making me feel small without ever raising his voice. And I let him." The words came out bitter with self-recrimination. "I was so grateful to be rescued from my father's debts, so relieved that someone wanted to take care of me, that I ignored every warning sign." Jake turned in his chair to face her fully. "Sarah Beth, you were 19 years old. Your father had just died, leaving you with nothing but bills and creditors. You did what you thought you had to do to survive." "Did I?" She looked at him directly for the first time since beginning her story. "Or did I take the easy way out, run away from something real because it was too scary, too uncertain?" The question hit Jake like a physical blow. They both knew what she was referring to. The choice he'd offered her 8 years ago. Marriage to a struggling rancher with more dreams than money, love without guarantees, a life built on hope rather than security. "You made your choice," he said finally. "Yes, I did. And it was the wrong one." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "God help me, Jake, it was the wrong one, and I've paid for it every day since." Jake's hands clenched into fists on his lap. Part of him wanted to reach out to her, to offer comfort. Another part, the part that had spent 8 years nursing his wounds, wanted to let her suffer with the consequences of her decision. "So what changed?" he asked. "Why now? Why last night?" Sarah Beth was quiet for so long that Jake thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Yesterday was supposed to be my sister Emma's wedding day. Charles insisted we host the reception at our house, another opportunity to show off his wealth and generosity. Everything had to be perfect. She paused, her hands trembling slightly. I was arranging flowers in the parlor when I accidentally knocked over one of his mother's crystal vases. It was an accident, just clumsiness. But Charles, she swallowed hard. He lost control. Completely lost control. Jake's jaw clenched. What did he do? He grabbed my arm so hard I thought he might break it. Started screaming about how I was embarrassing him, ruining everything, destroying his reputation. And then she touched her lip gingerly. He backhanded me, hard enough to split my lip and knock me to the floor. The violence in Jake's chest was immediate and hot. His hands gripped the arms of his chair so tightly the wood creaked in protest. But that wasn't the worst part, Sarah Beth continued. The worst part was what he said afterward. He stood over me while I was still on the floor bleeding and he said, "If you ever embarrass me like that again, I'll make sure you disappear, and no one will ever find you." Jesus. I believed him, Jake, the look in his eyes, and I knew he meant it. So I waited until he left for the bank, packed a few things and ran. I was going to take the train to Denver, start over somewhere new. But when I got to the station, she shook her head. I couldn't do it. I couldn't run away again, not without... Without what? She looked at him with those sage-green eyes that had haunted his dreams. Without telling you the truth. Without asking if there might still be a chance for us. The words hung in the morning air like a prayer and a challenge combined. Jake stared at her, his heart pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. After 8 years of anger and loneliness, of convincing himself he was better off alone, she was asking if they could find their way back to each other. Sarah Beth, I know I have no right to ask, she said quickly. I know I hurt you. I know I chose security over love, money over happiness. But I also know that what we had was real and maybe it's not too late. Jake stood abruptly and walked to the porch railing, his back to her. The desert stretched out before him, vast and unforgiving, a landscape that demanded strength and endurance from anyone who dared to call it home. He'd survived 8 years in this wilderness, built a life from nothing, learned to find contentment in solitude. But contentment wasn't happiness, and solitude, he was beginning to realize, wasn't the same as peace. What about Charles? He asked finally. He won't just let you go. Men like him don't give up their possessions easily. I know. Her voice was small but determined. But I can't live in fear anymore. I'd rather face whatever he brings than spend another day pretending to be someone I'm not. Jake turned back to her, seeing not the frightened woman who had appeared at his door last night, but the girl he'd fallen in love with, brave, honest, willing to fight for what mattered. Then we'll face it together, he said quietly. 3 days had passed since the storm, and Sarah Beth was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had found sanctuary at last. The bruise on her cheek had faded to a pale yellow, and the constant knot of fear in her stomach had finally begun to loosen. Jake had been nothing but kind and respectful, giving her space to heal while slowly rebuilding the friendship that had once meant everything to both of them. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard the sound of approaching horses. Rex began barking immediately, his hackles raised in a way that made Sarah Beth's blood turn cold. She dropped the shirt she'd been pinning to the line and ran toward the house, but Jake was already on the porch, his rifle in his hands. Get inside, he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the dust cloud approaching from the east. Jake, if it's Charles, I said get inside. The authority in his voice brooked no argument. Sarah Beth hurried into the house and peered through the front window, her heart hammering against her ribs. 4 riders were approaching at a steady gallop, and even at a distance she could make out the distinctive figure leading them. Charles Whitmore sat his horse like a man accustomed to getting his way. Even from here she could see the expensive cut of his clothes, the polished leather of his boots, the way he held himself as if he owned everything he surveyed. Behind him rode 3 men she didn't recognize, rough-looking characters who were clearly not bank employees. "Oh God," she whispered. "He brought gunmen." Jake appeared beside her at the window. "You know those men with him?" "No, but Charles has money. He can hire anyone he wants." She gripped Jake's arm. "Please don't let him take me back. I'll die before I go back to that house." Jake's jaw tightened. "He's not taking you anywhere." The riders pulled up in front of the house, their horses snorting and stamping in the morning heat. Charles dismounted with practiced ease and approached the porch, his 3 companions remaining mounted but ready. "Morrison!" Charles called out, his voice carrying the arrogant confidence of a man who believed money could solve any problem. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Jake stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held casually but ready. "Charles Whitmore." Can't say I'm surprised to see you. Then you know why I'm here. Charles removed his hat and smoothed his perfectly styled hair. My wife had a bit of a nervous episode. She's been confused, not thinking clearly. I've come to take her home where she can get the care she needs. That's not how she tells it. Charles's smile never wavered, but Sarah Beth could see the cold fury in his eyes even from inside the house. I'm sure she's told you all sorts of stories. Sarah Beth has always had an active imagination. But the fact remains that she is my lawfully wedded wife, and she belongs with me. Maybe you should ask her what she wants. I don't need to ask her anything. The mask of civility slipped slightly. She's my wife, my property, and I'm taking her home. Jake's grip tightened on his rifle. See, that's where you and I disagree. Last I checked, we abolished slavery in this country. One of Charles's hired men shifted in his saddle, his hand moving closer to his gun. Jake noticed the movement and adjusted his stance accordingly. Now, Morrison, Charles said, his voice taking on a reasonable tone that didn't match the threat in his eyes. Let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be. You're outnumbered 4-1, and my men are very good at what they do. Just send Sarah Beth out and we'll be on our way. No one needs to get hurt. Can't do that. Why? Because of some misguided sense of chivalry? Because you think she actually cares about you? Charles laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. She left you once before, Morrison. Ran straight into my arms the moment I offered her something better. What makes you think she won't do it again? Sarah Beth had heard enough. Before Jake could stop her, she opened the front door and stepped onto the porch beside him. The morning sun felt too bright on her face, and her legs trembled with each step, but she forced herself to stand straight and meet her husband's gaze. Hello, Charles. His expression softened immediately, transforming into the mask of concern he wore so well in public. Sarah Beth, darling, thank God you're safe. I've been so worried about you. Have you? Of course. When I came home and found you gone, I was beside myself. The doctor said you might be suffering from female hysteria, that you might do something dangerous in your confused state. He extended his hand toward her. Come along now. Let's go home and get you the help you need. I'm not confused, Charles, and I'm not sick. His smile faltered slightly. Darling, you're clearly not thinking straight. You're standing there in men's clothing, consorting with a common rancher. This isn't like you. You're right, Sarah Beth said, surprising him. This isn't like the woman you tried to turn me into, but it's exactly like the woman I really am. Sarah Beth, no. She cut him off, her voice growing stronger with each word. I'm done listening to you. Done pretending, done being afraid. Charles's mask slipped completely, revealing the cold fury beneath. You ungrateful little whore. After everything I've given you, everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me. Everything you've done for me. Sarah Beth stepped forward, anger overriding her fear. You mean isolating me from my friends, controlling every aspect of my life, hitting me when I didn't meet your expectations? I never... Don't. Jake's voice was deadly quiet. Don't even think about lying. I can see what you did to her face. Charles looked at Jake as if seeing him for the first time as a real threat, rather than just an obstacle. This is between my wife and me, Morrison. Stay out of it. Can't do that either. Then you're making a very serious mistake. Charles nodded to his men, who began to spread out slightly, flanking the porch. Last chance, Morrison. Send her out, or my men will come in and get her. Jake's response was to leave her around into his rifle chamber. The sound was sharp and final in the morning air. Your move, Whitmore. For a long moment, the two groups faced each other in tense silence. Sarah Beth could feel the violence building like electricity before a storm. Then Charles smiled, a cold, calculating expression that chilled her to the bone. You know, Morrison, you're right. This is America. A man shouldn't be forced to take back something that's clearly damaged goods. He looked at Sarah Beth with undisguised contempt. Keep her. But understand this. When she gets tired of playing house with a dirt farmer and comes crawling back, my door will be closed to her. Forever. He turned to remount his horse, then paused. Oh, and Morrison, the bank holds the note on this little ranch of yours. I'll be sure to mention to my father that you might be having trouble making your payments. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Jake's face remained impassive, but Sarah Beth could see the muscle jumping in his jaw. Your father's an honorable man, Charles. He wouldn't foreclose on a current loan just to satisfy your wounded pride. You're probably right, but my father won't live forever, and when he's gone I'll be running the bank. Charles mounted his horse and gathered the reins. Enjoy your freedom while you can, Mrs. Whitmore. Both of you." With that, he wheeled his horse around and rode away, his hired guns following. Sarah Beth and Jake stood on the porch watching until the dust cloud disappeared over the horizon. "He'll try to destroy us," Sarah Beth said quietly. "Probably. Aren't you afraid?" Jake looked down at her, and for the first time in days, she saw him truly smile. "Terrified. But I've been afraid and alone for 8 years. I'd rather be afraid and happy." Sarah Beth felt tears spring to her eyes, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, they were tears of joy rather than pain. "So, what do we do now?" Jake set his rifle aside and took her hands in his. "Now we build a life together. It won't be easy and it won't be safe, but it'll be ours. Promise me something. Anything. Promise me that no matter what Charles does, no matter how hard he tries to tear us apart, you won't let go of my hand." Jake lifted their joined hands and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Sarah Beth Coleman Morrison, I've been holding on to the memory of your hand for 8 years. I'm not about to let go of the real thing now." As they stood together on the porch of the ranch house, facing an uncertain future but no longer facing it alone, the desert wind carried the scent of rain on the horizon. Another storm was coming, but this time they would weather it together. In the distance, Rex barked once and then settled into the shade, content in the knowledge that his family was finally complete.